Well, good morning, church. I want to welcome Building A as well. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Luke chapter 19. We're in a series on Acts, but we're taking kind of a parenthesis out of the series to talk about idols in our lives. And we hit Acts 17 as a church, and Paul was in Athens where a city was full of idolatry. And we started talking about what are our idols, what are the idols we struggle with as a city, as an individual, as a church. And last week we looked at the idol of children, the idol of family, sometimes putting our children before the Lord and how that messes things up, and not only in the home, but also in our personal lives as well. And today I want to talk about something I warned you about last week. You came back anyway, so I guess you're okay to talk about this. We're going to talk about money. And whenever I talk about money, I want you to know that usually the giving that day is less than normal. And I think it's some kind of psychological thing of, he talked about money today, I'm not going to give, because then they'll think that we weren't giving before and we only gave because he talked about money. And so it's not about giving today. It's not about our budget. Our budget's great. We're doing great financially as a church. It's not even about our church. This talk is about you. This talk is about what I believe may be the second hardest idol we deal with in our lives. Maybe for you the primary is money and what you do with money. And does money control you, or do you use money to serve other people? I've recently been reading some excerpts from a book that was written in the 1830s by Alexis Tocqueville. Alexis Tocqueville wrote a book called Democracy in America. Of course, he was a French political thinker, historian, so you have to find one that translates into English for you to read, because I don't speak French. But he came to America, this free, wealthy, entrepreneurial society, and he made some very interesting observations. I want to read to you some of the observations he made. He said this: as one digs deeper into the national character of the Americans, one sees that they have sought the value of everything in this world only in the answer to the single question: how much money will it bring in? He also observed this, that there's a strange melancholy that haunts the inhabitants in the midst of abundance. He said that Americans believe that prosperity can quench their yearning for happiness. The incomplete joys of this world will never satisfy the human heart. I don't believe this man was a believer. He studied all different kind of world religions. He was a good thinker. But his observation in this country was there's a strange melancholiness that saturates the people. And they try to take things and replace it and make it the ultimate thing. What he was saying was, we look at possessions, money, stuff, and we say that's our God. And we position as our God, and then that God starts to control us. I thought that phrase, strange melancholy, was really interesting, because I've noticed myself in my own unofficial observations that there's a general sadness among people. Not everybody, and Don always makes fun of me because I think everyone's depressed in some form or fashion. But there's this strange sadness about us, and we have so much. When you think about what we have, we should be so happy if stuff makes you happy. Now, I believe most of us would say money doesn't make us happy. But I also believe that while we say that, there's a part of us that still thinks more money sure does make me more happy. If I had more money, it sure would go better for me than when I have less money. Now, it's true, I think money gives you more stuff. And I think there can be joy found in stuff. I don't think it's unbiblical to say that you can find some joy at times in a fun boat, in a fun house, in a fun car. And there's nothing wrong with those things. But when that pursuit becomes your identity, it becomes the core of your security, then it can become idolatrous. I want to make a few points today, and the first point I want to make is I believe even the most irreligious people worship something. I believe that what controls you, you ultimately worship. And even someone that says, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in the Bible, I don't believe in church, I don't believe in any of that stuff, what controls you is still your God. Another way of saying that is what brings you ultimate joy. What in your life takes your energy and your passion, and when it's taken away or it's diminished, brings sadness. That's a good opportunity to figure out if that's your God. Another point is even the most religious may not be worshiping God. I believe there are a lot of religious, even they would say spiritual people in our country. And I don't think they're worshiping the God of the Bible. They may even see Jesus as a helper, as a teacher. maybe as an example, even a moral good person. But they also believe that their morality is what's going to save them, and that is what we would call religion. Salvation comes by grace, not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, lest anyone should boast. I also believe there's this Christian mentality in America that if God really loves me, he'll bless me with more stuff. And if I have a lot of stuff, then God must be really happy with me. Now, again, none of us would probably say that, but I think there's some inside thoughts of when I'm not prosperous, God must be after me, or he's out to get me, or I've done something wrong, or there's some sin in my life that I have to deal with. When something happens in your life financially, the first thing is, okay, what do I need to confess to get right so that God will put me back on the gravy train again, right? And I think all these thoughts go through our heads when we struggle with these things. Matter of fact, if you pull out a dollar bill or 20 or any kind of American money, it says on the money, in God we trust. Do we? If someone were to follow you around for a month, would they say, I believe after following this person for a month, they trust in God and not money? Or would they say, I think they trust more in money? I think that's what makes them sad or makes them happy based on what's in their pocket. The Bible talks about a word called redemption. Redemption literally means to be freed from slavery. And Jesus said this, that my yoke is light. Take upon my yoke. It is not burdensome to you. I believe money is a yoke that is so burdensome, and it enslaves us. And I believe we become a slave to money. Some of you may be thinking, I don't have any money, so this sermon doesn't apply to me. I think it can be a yoked slave to you even when you're poor. I believe you can be greedy if you're rich. I believe you can be greedy if you're poor. I believe greed is determined by how much joy comes from how much you have or don't have. I believe you cannot have much and it's still your identity. I believe greed can come from how much you have anxiety about money. You may say, I don't want a lot of money, I don't hoard things, but are you anxious about money? Every time the months that come around, the bills, is there this growing anxiety of, oh my gosh, I know God takes care of the lilies of the field and the birds, and I think he says sparrows somewhere in there, but will he take care of me this month? And you start to re-question God's sovereignty in your life. Idolatry, I believe, is an attempt to either localize God, confine him. Sometimes we think of God being in a building, and we put limits around him. Sometimes idolatry is domesticating God. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. It's taming God. It's now God's dependent on me instead of me being dependent on God. Sometimes we view God as something that we want to alienate and blame because of circumstances in our life. I was talking to some friends this past week who went through a horrible accident with the husband of the family, and his life has been altered because of the accident. And we were talking about this issue of how so many folks over the years in ministry that I've seen, something bad happens, they get mad at God, they leave the church. They walk away from their faith. And they looked at me and said, that doesn't even make sense to me because it seems like in those times you should run to God the most because where else do you have to go? And I'm like, exactly, that's great theology. But sometimes we don't have great theology. And sometimes we run the opposite way. Sometimes we run to money. Another way I think we view God is sometimes we just want to dethrone him. And then we contrive him to be created in our image, and we get to decide who God is and what we want God to be like and what we want God to look like and act like. And again, a lot of times, the way we want God to act is based on prosperity. Whenever you talk about money, I can't help but think of God when he was talking about Israel when they were building the golden calf, and he said, these people are obstinate. He used the word obstinate. And they throw it, they literally shove it in my face is what God said. And another Old Testament word for that, and a New Testament word as well, because Paul uses it, would be God is jealous. Anything in your life that takes the place of where God should take in your life, God is jealous. God has all the rights to call your complete allegiance. And anything else that starts to gain your allegiance through your worry, through your patience, through your time, through your energy, that's what we call a God substitute. So we're talking about idols this month. We're talking about God substitutes. Like if someone were to follow you around, they would say that person follows the Lord or that person follows blank. And what's the blank in our lives? I think money would be filled in that blank for a lot of us. I agree, and I don't agree much with this guy, maybe if ever, but I agree with Friedrich Nietzsche when he wrote this. He said, with the absence of God growing in Western culture, we would replace God with money. Now, that's a secular atheist saying that. He says the natural thing is when you take God out, money becomes God. Now, the thing about being greedy is no one thinks they're greedy. Again, I've never had people tell me my big struggle is greed. I'm a greedy person. Or I spend way too much on myself, and because I spend so much money on myself, my family's suffering, my soul's suffering, and my relationship with the Lord's suffering. I never have people say that. And yet, Jesus talks more about money than he does immorality. Jesus talks more about money than he does about heaven and hell combined. And yet, this is so deep, the deception of money in our lives. So I think we ought to take the assumption, I think you ought to take the assumption, I take the assumption that I struggle with this area that we're talking about today. Even if I don't think I do, even if I don't know that I do. Because Jesus talks about it so much, it is a natural struggle in our lives. I think greed hides itself from the victims. Matter of fact, what happens is the reason we don't think we're rich is because we work so hard to get into a certain neighborhood, to get into a certain social status. And then we look at everyone else in that neighborhood, and compared to them, we have modest means. And so instead of comparing ourselves to the world, we start to compare ourselves to the social stratosphere that we've gotten ourselves to. And compared to those people, we don't feel rich. Matter of fact, only 2% of Americans say that they are in the upper class. 2%. Now, if you were to ask the rest of the world what percentage of Americans are upper class, what do you think they'd say? Probably 98%. So a lot of times it's just a perception of how we compare ourselves to people around us. Jesus warns us about this over and over and over and over. I want to look at Luke 19. Luke 19 is the story of Zacchaeus. You remember the little song we used to sing in Sunday school. He was a wee little man was he. And this story always strikes a chord in my heart because Zacchaeus, some of you are shaking your heads, I don't remember that song. A wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And he said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm coming to your house today, because I'm coming to your house today. Remember that? If you don't remember it, you didn't miss anything. It never hit top 20. It was never on iTunes. It really wasn't. Okay? Look with me at Zacchaeus in this story, verse 1. He entered Jericho and was passing through, he being Jesus, and there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. Now, the context of what's going on that you have to understand is Rome had conquered Israel, and their delegates were stationed in Israel, and they would take Jewish people and they would make them the tax collectors. And the Jewish tax collectors were hated people because the only rich people in Israel at this point were Roman citizens who stayed there and Jewish tax collectors. And they would oppressively lay taxes on the people, and then Rome would come and take all of this money, and they would take it back to Rome, and they would give it to Roman citizens. So as Rome's getting richer and richer, everywhere else in the world that they held under captivity was getting poorer and poorer. And so these tax collectors, matter of fact, in verse 2 where it says Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, it literally says arch collector. What that means was he was in charge of the entire system. This was probably the richest Jew left in Israel. And he was in cohorts with the Roman government. And so he would come, and we would call it today, we would call it extortion. He would come, instead of charging you 28%, which is what he should charge you, he would charge you 35%, take 7%, Rome would take 4%, he would keep back 3%, and he was filthy rich. And people hate him. Matter of fact, in verse 7, he's called a sinner. And that word sinner there literally means apostate. That no one in Israel liked this guy. He had given up everything, friends, family, social environments, in order to put God number one in his life. Not God, we know of, money. His God was money. His idol was money. He'd given up everything to be rich. And people hated him. And so Jesus is coming into town. And apparently this wee little man has a desire to see Jesus. I think that this man already was struggling with the realization that I've got all this money and I hate my life. I've got all this money and I don't have any friends. I've got all this stuff and no one to enjoy it with. I think he was having sleepless nights. I think he hears that Jesus is coming, and he's heard that Jesus can change people's lives, and he's wanting Jesus to change his life. He hasn't maybe identified yet money's the issue, but he just knows that he's got all the stuff that should make him happy, and he's miserable, and Jesus is coming to town. Now, before we get to the rest of the story, I want to show you another verse. This is Luke chapter 12, verse 15. And look at what Jesus says. He said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. It's the only place he says to take care and be on your guard. Jesus never says be on your guard against immorality. If you're committing immorality, you usually know you're committing immorality. If you find yourself in someone else's bedroom that's not your spouse, you're in the middle of that, you know what you're doing. But there's this deception about this idol called money that our hearts sometimes can't identify it as an idol. And so Jesus says, take care, be on your guard. Don't start to think that your life, your identity, consists of your possessions. And that word consists there, it means that your possessions starts to define who you are. That when you have a lot of possessions, you're happy. When it gets low, you're sad. Why do you think so many people jump out of 20-story buildings when the stock market crashes? Because their possessions consist of who they are. And so your financial status starts to define your personal status, and your personal status is defined by your financial status. I see this in church all the time. A lot of churches you'll go to, the richest guys in the room are the elders. And here's the mentality. Well, they're good in business, so they might be good in church administration. I think the reason you're an elder is because you're spirit-filled. That has nothing to do with your income. You're spirit-filled. You're the husband of one wife. You follow the Lord. Your children respect and fear the Lord. You have a daily time with him, a passion for him. And you give generously. Income doesn't mean you're successful in all of life. It means you're successful in one area of life. Or a lot of times people have big income, they just got lucky. You ever met someone that's kind of dumb as bricks, but they have a lot of money, and you're thinking, what gives? They just happen to be in the right place at the right time, maybe with the right partner. Maybe they just hit the right bubble at the right spot. And sometimes they just got lucky. But have you noticed how over time they start to think that they know a little bit about everything? That because they've done well here, that they should be asked their opinion on every issue? And those are the worst people in the world to have on the elder board, those people who think they know everything. So we like to take humble guys who don't know anything. We put them on our elder board. We call them elders. Just kidding. I may get fired next week. Elsewhere, Jesus comes right out and he just calls this what it is. Luke chapter 16, verse 13. He says, no servant can serve two masters, for he either will hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot. It is biblically, theologically, philosophically impossible. You cannot serve God and money. Although we as Americans still think, I think I can do both. I think I can pursue the American dream and still be sold out to the Lord. Instead, I become a sellout to money. I still think I can have it all, and my passion still leaps to God. I think you can, but it gets harder as you go. Jesus said it like this, easier for a rich man, a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to be in heaven. Doesn't mean rich people can't go to heaven. What it means is it's very difficult because all this stuff starts to cloud perception. It starts to make it hard. It's hard to be in a desperate daily dependence when I've got a huge portfolio. Now again, you may be thinking, I don't have any of that. Compared to who? Compared to the rest of the world? You do. Compared to the people in this room? Maybe. Compared to a few people you know? Probably not. Compared to the rest of the world, we are filthy rich. I've never missed a meal because I could not afford it. I am filthy rich. And so are you. We have enough. If you think you don't have enough, something is seriously wrong with you. Now, when Jesus says we serve money, he uses a word there for serve. It's the covenantal service of a servant to a king. What he says is this, when you serve money, money is now your master. When you serve God, I am your master. It's impossible to have two masters. So you've got to make a choice. And again, I ask the question, if someone were to follow you around for a month and have access to all your spending, what would they say? You see, when we talk about money, I don't think the issue is, we're not talking about, I can't give because I can't put food on the table for my family. We're talking about usually a third car. We're talking about usually a fourth DVR. We're not talking about, I can't give right now because I don't have clothes for my children to go to school. It's usually about those things that are really unnecessary but fun to have, and now they become ultimately things we have to have. Does that make sense? I've got an iPod, an old one that's got, I think, the lowest memory you can have. I still have never hit the limit of that. But yet there's something inside of me when I walk through Best Buy, I got to have more stuff inside there. I got to be able to do 5,000 songs. 5,000 songs are one message from my mother-in-law. I got to be able to put both of that on there, right? If your identity or security is in God, money can't control you through worry and desire. Or if your identity and security is in money, then it does control you through worry and desire. Notice what Jesus says in Luke 12. He says, watch out, be on guard. This is something that's never going to be easy for us. It's never going to go away. You're never going to wake up one day and say, I think I've spiritually arrived at the point that I never worry about money, and it's never becomes contrary to my heart anymore to pursue it. I think it's always an issue for us. Now let's go back to Luke 19. Let's see what happens with our wee little man named Zacchaeus. Look with me at verse 3. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not. He was short because he was small of stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass away. I think this is hilarious. In this time, for a grown man to climb up into a tree in public would have brought incredible disgrace. It would have been incredibly ridiculous, ridicule. They would have laughed this guy out of the city. And he climbed to the tree. I think he was desperate to have something in his life that had meaning to it, because he had all the stuff that everyone had told him would bring meaning, and it still felt meaningless. Look at the next verse. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. I love the fact that all of these religious people are at this place, and Jesus looked right past the religious people to the arch tax collector center. I love who Jesus wants to hang out with. It's usually the people your mama told you not to hang out with. That's who Jesus runs to. Look at the next verse. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be guest of a man who is a sinner. Now look at verse 8. This is really interesting. Zacchaeus stood and he said to the Lord, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. Now, what's the jump between verse 7 and 8? Because verse 7, or verse 6 really, Jesus says, come on down, we're going to your house, we're going to have fellowship together. And then you get to this verse 8 and he says, if I've stolen from anything. Now in the Old Testament, if you stole from someone, your job was to pay back 20% interest. What he says is, I'm going to pay back half. I'm going to pay back up to 4 times what I've stolen. This man's heart has already changed from his encounter with Jesus. His encounter with Jesus caused him to take money off the throne, and now God gets to be on the throne. And money becomes, money. It's just something to use. It's a tool. It's not something that runs our life. It's not something we find our identity in. It's something we use to serve other people with. It's a tool. And so already this man's heart is leaping towards something, someone now he knows. And his name is Jesus. And look what Jesus says to him. Jesus said in verse 9, today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Really interesting. This man gets the money issue right, and Jesus clarifies salvation. This man realizes the idol of his heart is greed, and asks the Lord to change it and to help him change it. And then all of a sudden, his heart has the right idol on top, and it's God. And when this man's heart has the right idol on top, he's controlled by Jesus. You see, you are controlled by who or what you serve. And who or what you serve other than Jesus becomes the idol of your heart. Is this making sense? And so this man had to have an idol change, if you will. You see, greed is not something you can just get out of your heart. It's something you've got to replace. You've got to supplant it. And so Jesus supplants the idol of Zacchaeus' heart with himself. I also think as I read the Bible, as I look at it, Jesus did the same thing for each of us. There's a verse in our Bible, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. Another way of saying this, we call this the great exchange. He who knew no sin became sin, so that you, the sinner, might become the righteousness of God. What this verse is saying is this: Jesus Christ left the treasure and richness of heaven. If you create the universe, you own the universe. If you own the universe, you can probably say, I'm on top of the Forbes list. I'm the richest one in the universe. He left all of that behind and became the poorest criminal who was killed on a cross. He left the riches to become poor so that you, the poor, us, the poor, me, the poor, the spiritually delinquent, could become rich. That's the gospel. Jesus gave up everything to have a relationship with you. One of the points I want to make this morning is to the degree that you grasp the gospel, money will have no dominion over you. To the degree that you grasp the gospel, money loses its ability to control you. To the degree you understand that he who is rich became poor so that you, the spiritually poor, could become eternally rich. Once I understand Jesus, the idol of my heart should change. Well, Pastor, I see a lot of Christians and it seems like they're still greedy. Remember, actions to the world speak more than proclamations do. You can tell everyone you're a believer. You can go to a building and say, I believe in Jesus. But the only thing the world has to really understand if that's true or not is your life. Now, does that mean I have to live in poverty to be spiritual? Not at all. There's a lot of unspiritual, poor people. Honestly, Jesus never says your paycheck or your bank account has anything to do with your spirituality. The danger is the larger it gets, the more on guard you need to be. That's the problem. You can be rich and godly. Matter of fact, I love rich, godly people. They are blessings. They're part of the big reasons we have this room to be in, because they gave money. And when their hearts are right, it is a beautiful thing. But when our hearts are torn between two gods, it is a destructive thing. Another point, the solution, I believe, to stinginess is a reorientation to the generosity of Christ. The solution to being controlled by money is to reteach the gospel to yourself daily. Another way of saying that is when you die, everything you've amassed will be distributed among your relatives, and some of them or most of them may not be very smart anyway. We said this before, when you die, people are going to go to your funeral, they're going to cry, they're going to go have Tex-Mex. And they're going to shoot the breeze, and life moves on. And everything you thought was so important is just not that important anymore. We're going to talk more about that next week. We're going to talk about the idol of success and what that means. On the top of your focus, or actually the bottom of your focus, I want you to read a quote with me. This is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a steel entrepreneur, built a large portion of the United States of America, filthy, incredibly rich. This is a quote that he made when he was 33 years old. He said, "Man must have an idol. The amassing of wealth is one of the worst species of idolatry. There is no idol more debasing than the worship of money." When he was 33, he said that, and he said also in his memoirs, by the time I turn 35, 2 years, I want to be done amassing money, and I want to spend the rest of my life reading and learning and growing. He never quit. 35 came and went. Okay, when I get 40. 40 came and went. Okay, when I get 45. 45 came and went. He never stopped amassing. I thought it was also interesting. I want to read you a quote of one of his steel workers, because one of the things that Andrew Carnegie did do is he built over 2,000 libraries across the United States of America. But one of his steel workers said this, and I'll quote, "We didn't want him to build a library for us. We would rather have had higher wages." The steel workers at that time worked 12-hour shifts. They stood on concrete floors that were so hot, they would have to build wooden platforms and nail them to their shoes so their feet wouldn't burn. They would have to go through periodically 24-hour inhumane shifts. And then after this 24-hour shift, they would get their one sole day off. Most of them died before they reached 45 of age because of disease and the work that they put into their jobs. And yet this man amassed fortunes. There's a great irony in America on our money and God we trust. I believe we probably spend more on coffee and music than we do on the gospel enterprise. I believe a lot of us spend more on our cable bill than we do to the gospel. Why do you say that? The latest stats tell us that 1 out of 5 people that attend an evangelical church every Sunday never give one dime to anything about ministry. Anything in ministry related, 1 out of 5. 71% give less than 2%. 71% of proclaimed Jesus idol followers give less than 2% of their income away to anything outside themselves. Again, actions speak louder than proclamations. We have found out in church, in most churches, that 20% of the people give 80% of the money. Our church is a little better. About 30% of the people give 70% of the money here. But our church is no different in the fact that 1 out of every 5 never give anything. We have no financial records, although they have attended for years. Well, if you're trying to make me feel bad, you've done a good job. That's not my goal. And my goal is not for you to give to the church. Here's my goal. My goal is for you to have the right idol on the throne. My goal is that you understand that the amassing of stuff, the consistency of possessions cannot be the identity of your lives. There are some women in this room that are giving their husbands grief because he's not making enough money. There are some men in this room that are giving their wives grief because they won't go out and work and they want to be home with the children. And vice versa both ways. What is godly about that? Because Jesus says, be on your guard. Your life does not consist of possessions. And yet we say we believe that. And yet our actions say we've got to get as much as we can. I always feel weird talking about money as a pastor because pastors, we're kind of weird individuals. I've said this before. You know, you go into a situation, hey, what do you do for a living? I'm a pastor, and just the whole room shuts down. It's just weird. Either people want to talk about the latest book they just read or they never want to talk to you again. And it's really interesting, too, when you talk about money as a pastor because as a pastor, you live your life in an aquarium in some ways. And so you can talk about money and then someone says, I want to go see what kind of car he drives. I want to see what kind of house he lives in. I want to see what kind of clothes he wears. Again, I don't think the biblical issue is even stuff. I think the biblical issue is what you put your trust in. I think you can be rich and faithful. Let me say this too. I think all of us in this room are rich. I think I am filthy rich. I make more money than I deserve to make. I have a nicer home than I deserve to have. I have better clothes. Usually, you won't see me wear the same shirt until like the 4th week after I wore it the last time. That's a pretty good rotation, right? I've got different pairs of shoes on now than I had last week. I am filthy rich. And there are people in the world that would just like to have a pair of shoes. Now, sometimes I think with a message like this, we go the other way of, well, I'll just give everything I have. I'll give it all away. No, you need clothing. You need shelter. You need food. You need to enjoy life. Solomon's real good about that. I think if you can afford a boat and it's not your idol, go get a boat and give as much money to the gospel as you can. And get the youth out on the boat and get people out on the boat and talk about Jesus on the boat and have friends over on the boat and be Jesus on the boat and invite your pastor on the boat. If you can afford a second home and still be very generous, afford a second home and use a second home as a blessing to the testimony of the Lord. But you got to be on guard that it's not your identity and it's not your idol and it's not your joy. Some of you look at the market every 3 minutes and you're not a financial consultant. And your joy, your mood changes daily based on some little ticker. You got to be on guard. I want to close with a few more points. I think another point is putting Jesus first brings just a strange contentedness to your life. Let me read a couple of verses to you. 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy 6, verse 17. He's warning Timothy about riches in this generation. He says this, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty. You see, the natural tendency when you have money is to think you're better than everybody. You kind of one-up everybody. Charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God. Make sure you teach them they got to have the right idol on the throne, and it's not money, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. See, I think biblically, it is sound to enjoy some stuff, as long as your joy is not found in the stuff. Let's look at verse 19, 1 Timothy 6. He goes on in his exhortation. He says, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so they may take hold of that which is truly life. Let me make another point as we wind down. Instead of increasing your standard of living, what would it look like for you to increase your standard of giving? I think many of us wake up each morning thinking how we can make more money. What if you woke up each day thinking, how can I give more away today? How can I give more stuff away? How can I use the stuff that God's given me to help somebody today? To give 10%, Pastor, of my income, that would make me change my life. Exactly. You get to change your life around Christ. I get asked these questions, so I'll briefly describe this. People ask, well, how much should you give? The Bible never says, it doesn't say 10%. 10% was an Old Testament thing. Actually, it's about 30 to 35% in the Old Testament. The New Testament is give everything you can, consistently, sacrificially. See, God kind of leaves that open so you'd have to deal with and struggle with daily. It's rigged incredibly well. That you have to, ongoing basis, pray about how much God would have you give. And so if you can give 5% and that's you trusting God to provide, then start there. And then pray throughout the year, God, what would it look like for you to bless me in such a way that I could give 10% next year? And see what he does. And again, we're not talking about food and clothes. We're talking about DVRs and data plans. So let's just get honest about that. Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, could become rich. The goal of our lives is to spend everything that he's given us eternally. Because we're going to get reimbursed in eternity. And every blessing you have, enjoy. Enjoy those blessings. If you like to play golf, go play golf. Eat a Snickers. Enjoy your family. Go on a cruise. Go to Europe if you can afford it without being in a bind financially. And give in gracious, crazy ways. And watch how God provides as you become more generous. I think a lot of times God hasn't blessed us more because we haven't been a blessing yet. And when you become a blessing, God just opens up the vats of heaven. My hope for you is that you would be content in Jesus alone. He is enough. The young couple I sat with Friday was Bill and Paula Ferris. Don and Ellsworth was with me, and David Bixby. And if you remember back in the summer, Bill was the one who fell from a bunk bed and became paralyzed neck down. One day he's fishing, the next day he can't move his body. And 6-7 months later, he can now move his feet and his hands. They said he would never move again. And to sit there with him Friday, and they're smiling, and they're talking about what the Lord's doing through this, how lives are being changed. As he's talking, he's being fed through a tube. I tell you, boy, that brings some sobriety to your day. And I'm frustrated with my brakes need being replaced. And as I'm sitting there talking to him, Bill looks at me and he goes, when I can stand up, I'm going to stand on that stage and tell them my story. And I told Bill, I said, I don't care what sermon I got planned or what's going on that day. When you're ready, you're standing. So I look forward to the day that Bill stands here and tells you a story. But get sober a little bit. Go walk through a grave sometime. Go walk through a cemetery. Think about death a little bit. And it just puts into place, your life can change like that. I could step off this stage in a minute and fall and never move again. And that God really does hold your life by a thread. And as Jonathan Edwards says, he holds the scissors. And he does it in such a way so that you realize there's only one true God, and you're not it, and money can never be it. And there is one who sustains all things, and his name is Jesus. And that you would put your trust in Jesus. Lord, thank you for a reminder from your word that the danger of money and how we can struggle with it. Father, truth is, you know our hearts on this topic. You know in this room who's struggling with this topic. You know how I struggle in this topic. I pray that we'd be generous, wealthy people in this world. I pray, Father, that we would feel rich simply because we have a relationship with you. And the perspective of the fact that you gave your son up so that we could have a relationship with you makes us extremely wealthy. Lord, I also pray for the men and women in this room that may be financially struggling. Maybe it's bad decisions they've caused, or maybe it's situations caused and they had no control over those situations. I pray that they would be faithful in giving even when it doesn't seem like that's what they should be thinking about. And I pray that you would miraculously show them how you own 1,000 cattle on 1,000 hills. How you are the creator of all. Father, I pray that we'd worship you and worship you alone. It's in your name. Amen.